Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. We're just going to give folks a few minutes to join, so we'll get started at around 2:01. All right, great. Thank you all for being here today. Good afternoon. My name is Abby Edwards. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Adaptation Planning Grant Program Manager on the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program team. I'm joined by my teammates Brandon and Sarah, and Brandon will be on tech support today, so let him know if you have any questions or challenges. So I want to begin this meeting by acknowledging that the state of California exists on the occupied territory of over 110 federally recognized tribes and over 70 non-federally recognized tribes. This land has been stewarded by Indigenous people since time immemorial. We acknowledge the critical importance of these lands and waters to Indigenous people of California today. And we at the Office of Planning and Research join you all from Sacramento, California, on ancestral territory of the Southern Maidu, the Valley Miwok, the Patwin, and the Misinau people. So if you're up for it, please share your name, your organization, and where you're calling in from in the chat. That would be great. We also recognize the commitment that it takes to attend these sessions. This is the last of our Adaptation Planning Grant Program workshops. So we really appreciate you all being with us today. And so thanks again. And we're recording the session, so we'll be able to share it out afterward as well. So today we're going to talk through some of the elements of the Adaptation Planning Grant Program. We'll go over a very high level overview. We've already recorded an overview session and shared that out, and that's on our website too. So we're not going to repeat the full application process. And we're also going to share that recording in the chat for those that want to watch that. And then we'll go over the timeline, we'll go over application components. And then the bulk of the session will be facilitated by the Office of Emergency Services, who will talk through federal funding opportunities. So I anticipate this first portion facilitated by Sarah and I, just taking 5 to 10 minutes. And then the OES portion will take around 45 to 50 minutes. And feel free to ask questions as we go along. And then we'll also hold some time at the end for Q&A as well. So here's a quick overview of our program timeline. As folks may remember, we kicked off engagement last March. We developed the draft program guidelines, had a public comment period. We launched the program intent survey in November, and we released the application materials in January. And applications close at the end of this month. And we also expect awards to announce awards sort of in early summer. So quick overview of what the program is all about. The Adaptation Planning Grant Program leverages $25 million to fund local, regional, and tribal communities in integrated climate adaptation planning. By facilitating climate adaptation planning, Adaptation Planning Grant Program supports development of climate resilient projects across the state. So we have $6.6 million available for our first round of funding, and the awards will be from $150,000 to $650,000. So through our 2022 engagement, we identified and refined the priorities of the program. So the first is to explicitly and meaningfully prioritize equitable outcomes, particularly in the most vulnerable communities, by establishing an inclusive funding program that removes barriers for applicants and also ensures that awardees represent a wide geographic, economic, and population diversity. So the second is to encourage communities to equitably plan for and respond to multiple climate risks by centering the needs of vulnerable communities and supporting an all-risk approach to adaptation planning. So these grants really encourage communities to conduct integrated planning activities. Thirdly is to support integrated social and physical infrastructure planning to achieve community resilience. So this program intends to provide flexible funding to meet multi-sector and issue planning needs that intersect with climate risks, including but not limited to land use, transportation, economic, housing, natural resource management, public infrastructure, and hazard mitigation issues. Fourth is to build statewide capacity to plan for and implement equitable planning strategies, and that's by supporting peer-to-peer learning, communities of practice, information sharing, and the publishing of case studies on the State Adaptation Clearinghouse. And then lastly is really to embed equity into the planning process from project visioning all the way through to project evaluation. That's by increasing opportunities for shared decision-making, utilizing inclusive processes, and actively remediating historic underinvestment by fairly distributing access to the benefits and privileges that are associated with community investment. So those are some of our kind of high-level priorities of the Adaptation Planning Grant Program. And so in order to apply, so we have local public entities, California Native American tribes, community-based organizations that include 501c3 nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, philanthropic organizations, foundations, and other organizations with a history of representing vulnerable communities. And then we also have this partnership requirement. So we have a minimum of one co-applicant in addition to the lead applicant, and more than one co-applicant is encouraged. So we have all of this really outlined in a lot of detail in our grant guidelines that the link I believe has been shared in the chat for you all to kind of look into to learn more about these requirements. And then in order to apply, applicants complete the request for full application, which is the intent survey, and that's from November 7th to the 31st of this month, and we are accepting those on a rolling basis. And then as I mentioned, early in January, we released the NOFA and all the application materials. And as I mentioned, applications are due at the end of the month. And then in April, we'll be conducting sort of an interagency review panel of the grants. And then, as I mentioned, early summer, announcing the awards. So that's kind of the overview of how to apply, what the application and what the program is all about. I'm now going to hand it over to Sarah, who's going to talk through some of our eligible activities.
Thanks, Abby. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Samden, and I'm an associate planner at OPR, where I oversee our FEMA portfolio. Over the past few years, there's been a significant amount of federal investments made for pre-disaster planning grant programs. Through our partnership grants with FEMA, we've been working with the California Office of Emergency Services to help state agency partners navigate and identify eligible projects to apply to FEMA hazard mitigation assistance grants. We are really focused on identifying opportunities to align state climate resilience goals with federal hazard mitigation funding. The APGP program seeks to serve as proof of concept of how a state climate resilience funding program can be aligned with FEMA HMA eligibility and considerations to support communities leverage federal implementation funding. While APGP only has funding for planning grants, we really understand the need to proactively connect folks to implementation funding. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that applicants interested in using APGP funding to develop a FEMA eligible application must also meet APGP application requirements, as Abby mentioned. And I listed a few different opportunities that we are thinking APGP funding can be used to use for FEMA activities. APGP funding may be used to develop a project application for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program or the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, both of which are annual funding programs, as well as the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is opened after a disaster. APGP funding can also be used to support a local hazard mitigation plan update or a tribal mitigation plan update. This funding can also be used as match for HMGP DR 4683, which is a funding pot that was recently opened after the winter storms that we experienced earlier this year. The timing to use APGP funding with BRIC or FMA for match might be a little bit challenging given the period of performance timelines that we have for APGP round one. but is definitely a possibility for future rounds of APGP funding. Our Cal OES colleagues are going to walk us through application requirements and share promising practices when applying to FEMA grants. Now I'll hand it back to Abby, who will walk us through round 1 APGP application review and award timelines.
Thanks, Sarah. And we actually just have one more slide for you all, and then we're going to hand it over to the OES team to talk through the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Programs. This is just kind of outlining the next steps. So we're reviewing those intent surveys as they come through. We're still holding office hours every Wednesday from 1 to 2. And we let folks in, we give each group 10 minutes with us, and we let folks in the order in which they came. We have this workshop, which is our last. We're updating the FAQ on our website weekly. So definitely keep an eye out for those, for any changes, any questions that come through our inbox or through those office hours. We're updating the FAQ with those answers and questions that come through. And then lastly, if you have any speaking opportunities where you'd like us to come talk about this grant, we're happy to do so. So that is that little plug. We are really excited to have the OES team with us. So we're just going to hand it over to them to talk through as I mentioned, the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Programs. So Scott, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Abby. Yeah, so as Abby said, my name is Scott Ball, and I support Cal OES with their hazard mitigation assistance programs. And really today's presentation on the hazard mitigation assistance grants is a high level overview of the funding opportunities, when they become available, why they become available, and some of the activities that could be pursued with this funding. So with that said, Abby, if I could get the next slide. Next slide, please. So FEMA has 3 programs under their mitigation grant portfolio or umbrella. The first is the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. This is a nationally competitive annual program that is generally announced in August of each year. As we're still waiting for that the funding to be announced, we don't know how much will be available, but it is intended to address properties or mitigate properties that are subject to frequent flooding and are insured under the National Flood Insurance Program. So that's a really key point with the FMA program. I'll talk a little bit more about FMA moving forward, but high level summary there. The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, is a little more prominent in California. It is similar to the FMA program, nationally competitive annual program. So states like California are competing against Texas, New York, Florida, so on and so forth, and all the sub applications are submitted to FEMA. They convene a national technical review panel to evaluate, score, and prioritize projects submitted for funding, and then ultimately determine which projects are funded. So that's what's meant by nationally competitive. BRIC is focused on critical infrastructure or projects which mitigate critical infrastructure. These are generally larger dollar projects that are pursued under BRIC as well. And then last is a program that is much more frequently available these days in California, which is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP. This funding is made available to states after a federally declared disaster. So in this case, California just recently opened up or released a notice of funding opportunity for DR 4683. Again, that was the atmospheric river events that took place earlier this year, and now there's funding that's being made available. This is not nationally competitive. The funding is made available statewide. So you are competing against other counties, cities, special districts. Private nonprofits are eligible as well for hazard mitigation grant program funding. So just a quick overview of those funding types, and have you next slide. That said, as you can imagine, there's always strings attached with federal funding. And with that in mind, there are really some basic components that must be evaluated to determine if you or your community is eligible for this funding. So first, you must be an eligible sub-applicant. That's commonly counties, cities, towns, special districts. And again, for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, that's private nonprofits. Be mindful that private nonprofits are not eligible to apply for BRIC or the FMA program. Businesses, individuals are not eligible to apply individually for any of these grants. There are projects that impact private property, but the sub-applicant for that funding would ultimately need to be an eligible sub-applicant. The sub-applicant must have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan. These plans expire every 5 years, so they are kind of on a revolving basis. You must have a plan in place for BRIC and FMA at time of both sub-application and FEMA award of funding. For the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, you are required to have a mitigation plan at time of award. It doesn't have to, you do not have to have that plan at time of sub-application. So really key difference between these programs, and certainly something to be mindful of. No projects are eligible for which ground disturbing or construction has begun. FEMA must ensure that all the projects comply with the National Environmental Protection Act. In order to do that, they have to review the projects and evaluate impacts in relation to the environment and determine that there are not significant impacts so as to prevent funding to the project. Beginning work prior to FEMA award undermines that, and FEMA cannot ensure compliance with NEPA. You must have a notice of interest submitted to Cal OES and approved. That is a high-level summary of your project. It is not a full sub-application, but it enables Cal OES to evaluate your proposal, ensure that the project is eligible and is likely feasible and trending towards cost-effective. So be mindful that notice of interest is a requirement that if approved, then you would move on to developing a full sub-application for funding, which is much more in-depth and detailed and time-intensive. All projects must have a clear level of protection increase. And what is meant by that is we cannot generally do repair, replacement, maintenance-related activities under this program. Those would not have a clear level of protection. For instance, an activity that would have that would be modifying an existing levee that currently offers 10 or 50-year protection to go to a 100-year flood event level of protection. That would be a clear level of protection increase and would be eligible for funding. Projects must demonstrate cost effectiveness using FEMA's Benefit Cost Analysis Toolkit version 6.0. This is generally one of the more difficult components of the sub-application. It requires a lot of documentation and support to be credible. The intent of the benefit cost analysis is to demonstrate to FEMA that for every dollar being put forth or spent in the project, that there's a commensurate future benefit or risk reduction benefit. These projects do require, generally speaking, a 25% cost share or a local cost share or match. That can come in the form of cash, in-kind, staff in-kind time and services, or some combination of both, but there is a match requirement. The period of performance for these grants is generally 36 months or 3 years. BRIC and FMA do allow for longer periods of performance, but generally it is a 3-year period performance. We must ensure that there is an independent mitigation solution. And so what that means is that there cannot be a partial solution being proposed as part of the sub-application with the intent to complete the project at a later date. This sometimes happens with large infrastructure-based projects where the cost is so high that a community says, well, we're going to need 5 to 10 years for our capital improvements fund to replenish, and we'll come back and complete the work at that point. There would be no assurance to FEMA that the community would ultimately do that. And so we have to make sure that we've got a self-contained standalone mitigation solution with any proposal. Projects and sub-applicants must comply with federal procurement requirements as outlined in 2 CFR 200, as well as any applicable local and state procurement requirements. The most restrictive of the 3 is what applies. So for instance, if the 2 CFR outlines that you must openly and competitively procure for work exceeding $250,000, but your local procurement requirements require you to openly and competitively procure at $50,000, you would have to open and competitively procure at $50,000. We also have to comply with the environmental historic preservation or NEPA requirements. Certainly if CEQA is applicable and you do not have an exemption, you would still have to comply with that as well. And last, for 4683 funding, again, Cal OES has recently released their notice of funding opportunity. They have outlined funding priorities as well as competitiveness criteria. So certainly if you're looking at pursuing funding under this grant, please make yourself very familiar with the NOFO, and you would want to have a project which aligns as well as possible with Cal OES's funding priorities, as well as incorporates as many of the competitiveness criteria as well. And then for the BRIC and FMA program, FEMA outlines its scoring criteria in the technical and qualitative criteria each year with its NOFOs. And you would want to make sure that you're putting forward projects that, again, align well with that scoring criteria. Next slide, please. So this slide really, again, just reiterates what is the triggering event for these 3 programs. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, again, is made available to states after a presidential disaster declaration. For BRIC and FMA, it is triggered by the release of the NOFO by FEMA in August, generally of each year. As far as next steps are then concerned, sub-applicants certainly are encouraged, if you're evaluating pursuing this funding, scheduling project scoping calls. That's a great opportunity to really talk through your project so that you can get feedback from Cal OES on how viable this project is likely to be, how competitive for funding it may be, as well as kind of really prevent you from putting a lot of time and effort and energy into projects that don't align well or wouldn't be eligible. Then notices of interest are due for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and BRIC, and then we go into the sub-applications being due to Cal OES and FEMA for the programs. Next slide, please. So I don't know that I can reiterate the importance of the hazard mitigation planning requirement enough. Again, just to be very clear, for BRIC and FMA, you must have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan in place at time of sub-application and at time of award. For the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, it is just at time of award. Some key items about the mitigation plans. Sometimes a single community has an expired plan. You can potentially coordinate with your county for them to be the sub-applicant. There's a lot of grant minutia and administrivia that is associated with that process. The county would have to seek reimbursement and submit those requests for reimbursement to CalWS. They'll have some grant management responsibilities as well, but that is one way to potentially meet that planning requirement if your plan's expired. And then last, what we are seeing is that a lot of communities, unfortunately, are going through that window where those plans are lapsing, where there was a glut of funding in 2017, that 5-year period of eligibility is closing. So in light of this, we're seeing a lot of interest in mitigation planning funding. One thing we would encourage communities to evaluate before moving forward with seeking grant funding for that is when your plan expires, these plans, even though they're not involving ground disturbing activities or construction, still do take a significant amount of time to work their way from the CalWS review and submission process to FEMA, FEMA's subsequent review, and ultimately to award. So if you're concerned about losing eligibility for the hazard mitigation assistance grants, and you have some pressing projects that you want to get funded, you may want to consider self-funding and kind of investing in that mitigation plan and updating it yourself with local funding, as opposed to seeking grant funding and then ultimately being eligible to be reimbursed for those larger dollar projects. Next slide, please. Another item that we see commonly impacting eligibility is duplication of programs. And at the highest level, what this means is FEMA cannot provide federal funding for an activity which another federal agency has primary responsibility. So for instance, one thing that we commonly see is performing wildfire mitigation activities on federal land. The U.S. Forest Service is given money to maintain and mitigate their land. And as a result, the expectation is from FEMA that the U.S. Forest Service does that, as an example. If same applies to the Bureau of Land Management. We know in the West, BLM owns a lot of land. So be mindful of this, this wrinkle in the program, so to speak. Certainly, this is something that we'll ask questions about during any project scoping calls. Another example that we commonly see is levees that are owned and maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We certainly understand that, again, there's not necessarily all the funding that's necessary to maintain and really have these systems provide the mitigation that's intended. That said, you can't come to FEMA for that funding. Those federal agencies are still responsible and have primacy there. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit more about the details of the flood mitigation assistance program with the next slides. So as stated earlier, first and foremost, a community must be proposing to protect structures that are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program is funded in part by premiums from the National Flood Insurance Program. And so as a result, it's congressionally mandated that this program address flood risk to these properties. FEMA does prioritize funding which would mitigate flood impacts to severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss properties. The intent being that while those properties represent a small portion of the NFIP insurance portfolio, they represent a significant amount of claims and insurance losses to that program. So these are structures which frequently flood and are most at risk. So FEMA has prioritized funding to mitigate these. Another component of the flood mitigation assistance program is this CDC Social Vulnerability Index. It also applies to the BRIC program as well. FEMA does this program, as well as BRIC, is part of the Justice 40 initiative under the current administration, and the intent is to provide at least 40% of the funding available to vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. Some of the activities at a high level of what can be pursued under this is FEMA has broken the activities down to really three sections. So there's the individual flood mitigation projects. These are activities that have historically been funded using the flood mitigation assistance grants. So that would be purchasing properties that are in the floodplain, as an example, demolishing those, and putting those properties under a deed restriction in perpetuity, so there can be no future development. That is a very effective way of preventing future losses and damages in the floodplain. Elevation projects as well. So those are very common types under the individual flood mitigation projects. Localized flood risk reduction is really using more infrastructure-based solutions to reduce risk. These could be, as an example, detention or retention ponds, which would provide water storage and prevent that water from flooding communities and homes and property. There's also the capability and capacity building activities. Cal OES always prioritizes project scoping. Project scoping is intended to provide seed funding to communities to evaluate their risk and really identify preferred alternatives to implement a project which is going to reduce that flood risk. So if you're as a community are subjected to frequent flooding, but don't necessarily know the source of that flooding or what is causing that or how best to mitigate that, capability and capacity building fundings would be what you'd be looking at, so that you could perform that design and engineering. You could fund a H&H study, and you could get to the bottom of what's causing the issue and then design that solution. Next slide, please. All right, I'll cover the Building Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, next. So similar to the flood mitigation assistance, again, this is a nationally competitive program, and I can't emphasize the word competitive enough. Communities that are not going to be touching on a lot of the qualitative and technical scoring criteria that FEMA releases each year in the NOFO probably shouldn't pursue this funding. Again, you're going to be put up against the best projects across the country, and the projects which best align with those priorities are going to be funded. Again, we're generally looking at projects which are going to be mitigating infrastructure. So if you have a bridge that is subject to impacts and flooding, or it could be destabilized by an earthquake, that would be potentially a good project. Levies as well is commonly pursued under this funding. So just to give you a sense of this is large infrastructure projects, and I think we have a slide coming up just to kind of give you an idea of the general size and scope of BRIC. As noted earlier, BRIC is a part of the Justice 40 initiative. So communities that are identified as socially vulnerable per the Centers for Disease Control maps certainly would be more competitive than those that are not. Inclusion of nature-based solutions is a high priority from FEMA under this program. We've seen in some years almost 80% of the projects that are identified for funding include nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions is, as an example, restoring wetlands or restoring streams and rivers to increase their capacity and convey water more efficiently. The reason why FEMA is prioritizing these are they're more resilient to the impacts of climate change. There's less maintenance required, and there's a ton of aesthetic, tourism benefits, quality of life benefits that kind of fall out from this approach as well. Projects which address future conditions, so that's changes in population, demographics, land use, in addition to climate change, are more competitive than those that don't. Projects where there's a public-private partnership. You may be able to partner with a private entity that stands to benefit from mitigating infrastructure in their area. As an example, we've seen a substation that was powering Facebook's servers. And so they were willing to provide some of the match for a project whereby there was going to be some mitigation benefits to protecting that power supply to their servers and operations. Projects must have a building code effectiveness grading scale or BSEG score, at least of 5.5 or lower, and also have these reliable data sources to substantiate the effectiveness of the project and its overall benefits. Next slide, please. All right, I'll cover the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program next. Again, this is triggered by a presidential disaster declaration. Funds are administered by the Cal OES Hazard Mitigation Branch. They establish and set the priorities for the funding. They are responsible for reviewing sub-applications, making sure that they are eligible, feasible, and cost-effective prior to submitting them to FEMA. So they facilitate what's known as a request for information or RFI process to make sure that any issues or concerns are addressed prior to submitting those sub-applications to FEMA. Cal OES does keep an open rolling sub-application because of all of the recent disasters which have been taking place. So Cal OES generally has a wait list of projects that are ultimately not submitted. For each round of funding, they then go back through their sub-applications and evaluate ones that have already been submitted but not submitted to FEMA to determine, hey, does this fit with our priorities under this round of funding, and is this something that we could move forward? I have talked about some of the last bullets, so I don't want to harp on those again. Next slide. So this is a high-level summary of some of the activities that are eligible as far as project types. We'll talk about hazards and common mitigation activities to address those hazards in the upcoming slides. But just to give you a sense of some of the activities that are eligible, so we've talked about hazard mitigation plans, right? If you are updating a plan or your community has never had a hazard mitigation plan before, that is certainly something you could seek funding for through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. There's also what's known as the 5% initiative. The 5% initiative is really funding for projects whereby there is not an established BCA methodology that can be applied. An example of that is hazard warning systems, right? It's hard to specifically say because we've invested in a warning system, we saved X lives as a result of that. It's reasonable to believe that that is the case, but from the kind of confines of the benefit cost analysis and the requirements of that, we can't make those assumptions, and as a result, there is this 5% initiative. As the name indicates, it's only 5% of the available funding under HMGP. 5% initiative does not apply to the BRIC or FMA program, so it's only under HMGP. I do want to note that Cal OES has deprioritized 5% initiative funding under DR 4683. We'll talk a little about more of those priorities here in a little bit, but be mindful of that. I talked about in the flood mitigation assistance program about capability and capacity building and project scoping projects. In the hazard mitigation grant program, that's known as advanced assistance. Advanced assistance is very similar. The intent is, again, for years, FEMA heard from communities that said, look, your expectation is you want shovel-ready projects that are designed, that are ready to go. Well, if we had that, we would have started work. We would have already moved forward. And so in light of that recurring feedback from local communities, FEMA created advanced assistance and said, okay, we'll start to give you some seed funding to develop this pipeline of projects for funding so that you can pursue the actual construction and implementation at a later date. Cal OES does prioritize project scoping. So the expectation is that you're doing that alternatives analysis. You are then determining what the preferred alternative is. You are taking that preferred alternative to 60% design. You're developing a benefit cost analysis on it. You're developing a full sub-application for funding under BRIC, FMA, or a future round of hazard mitigation grant program. And last, and certainly not least, is what we generally consider the bread and butter of the program, projects. So this is, hey, we know what we're going to do, and we are seeking funding to actually implement. So that could be defensible space projects for wildfire. That could be levee systems or flood walls to mitigate floods. And also there is this added flexibility in projects to either phase your project or not, right? So if you're not phasing your project, the expectation is that you have generally at least 60% design complete for your project. That allows FEMA to really assess kind of what the footprint of the project is and evaluate any environmental historic preservation impacts. If you know what your proposed solution is, but do not have 60% design, or in the case of wildfire, what we frequently see is you don't know where you're going to be performing the work. That requires outreach to property owners and then voluntarily participating to sign up for defensible space work, as an example. We would say, okay, you need to phase your project. Phase one would be for you to finalize that design, do that outreach, identify exactly where you'll be performing your work, preferably complete CEQA analysis if required, and provide those deliverables to FEMA. They can then review and evaluate those deliverables. And if the project remains cost effective, they would then award funding for phase two of that project. Phase two would actually be the construction or implementation of the project. Next slide, please. Okay, so more on the notice of funding opportunity for DR 4683. Next slide. So Cal OES, again, I strongly encourage you to search for their notice of funding opportunity that really goes into a lot of depth and detail on what's available or how Cal OES is prioritizing funding under DR 4683. That said, some high-level items for your consideration. First off, Cal OES is incorporating some of those competitiveness criteria that we've historically seen under BRIC. So projects which are benefiting disadvantaged communities, which are incorporating nature-based solutions, which evaluate future conditions, as well as some other criteria are certainly prioritized for funding over those that are not. There is again, a cost share here for this program, 75, 25%. That said, Cal OES does have approximately $48 million of state funding under the Prepare CA Match program that is going to be allocated to this. So certainly something to keep an eye out for, and certainly evaluate if you're eligible for. Cal OES does have a social vulnerability heat map that is available online, and you can evaluate if you meet the criteria and would be eligible for that funding. Next slide, please. So as far as priorities for this funding, first off, again, as I noted, there is a significant amount of plans that are lapsing. So Cal OES, in recognition of that, has prioritized hazard mitigation planning as their highest priority for funding. Be mindful that, again, if your plan is going to expire prior to 2026, you may want to self-fund so that you can remain eligible for this funding. But mitigation planning is the highest priority. Second is advance assistance. Cal OES is capped at either $10 million or 25% of the total funding available for advance assistance of funding. So this is a small set aside of the overall funding that's available. Again, this is enables communities to assess and evaluate hazard impacts and determine kind of what's the best way to mitigate those, and then design and engineer a solution, and then develop a sub-application for future rounds of funding. Next slide. In priority level 3, Cal OES has put projects. So again, this is where we historically think of when we think of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This is for project implementation. This is for wildfire mitigation, flood mitigation, seismic, drought mitigation, critical infrastructure protection, critical infrastructure and utility protection projects. And I'll give you some examples of what those may be. But projects which are above $5 million are kind of 3A. So you can immediately see that Cal OES is prioritizing larger dollar projects. They must at least also address one of the criteria below, meaning protect a socially vulnerable community, implement or include nature-based solutions, advance whole community risk reduction, and or protect high impact critical infrastructure. The minimum would be meeting one of those. The more that the project is inclusive of these criteria, the more competitive it would be within this pot of funding. And then 3B would be projects that meet the same criteria I've noted, but are less than $5 million. Next slide, please. And last is priority 4. And I really want to emphasize that these are projects that did not fall in categories 1 through 3. This would be planning related activities, 5% initiative projects that are not addressing or inclusive of socially vulnerable communities. Cal OES expects that it will receive more interest in sub-applications than it has funding for. In which case, right, these projects would then go to this category. Really want to note Cal OES is being very transparent. They will review these projects last, right? They're going to work through their entire priorities and evaluate what they've received and prioritize projects that fall in categories 1, 2, and 3 for funding, and really review those, go through the request for information process. And if funding remains available, would then tap into priority 4. but they are saying that we can't guarantee that there will be that much funding available, in which case they would not review the sub-application. It would likely not be submitted to FEMA. So really, again, familiarize yourself with with these funding priorities and kind of understand where you would lie before really, taking next steps and spending a lot of time and energy with these very time-intensive sub-applications. Next slide, please. As far as the timeline for DR 4683 HMGP funding, Cal OES released the NOFO March 1st. If you are interested in scheduling, in discussing a project you're evaluating, submitting for funding, Cal OES does provide project scoping calls. Those could be done prior to submitting a notice of interest. And in fact, that's encouraged. That way, there's not a notice of interest for a project which is completely ineligible, which was submitted and then has to be adjudicated. That allows Cal OES to quickly kind of sort the wheat from the chaff from an eligibility perspective. And then, but Cal OES is accepting currently notices of interest. They're saying that they're formally opening that in March 31st, but you can submit notices of interest now. And Cal OES will accept those notices of interest up to May 10th of this year. After May 10th, all the notices of interest will have been reviewed and adjudicated to determine eligibility. Often that requires a follow-up phone call with the sub-applicant to really better understand the notice of interest or ask any questions and address any concerns related to eligibility, feasibility, cost effectiveness at that point. On June 2nd, Cal OES will formally open its Engage portal, and that would enable communities with approved notices of interest to begin drafting their sub-application. And final sub-applications are due to Cal OES August 4th. Once those are submitted to Cal OES, that then starts the formal request for information process. Somebody would be assigned the sub-application, will review it, and follow up with communities to schedule calls and provide written feedback on revisions that are required before the sub-application can be submitted to FEMA. Next slide. Okay. Yeah, these are just to give you, the next slides are really intended to give you all an idea of what projects are commonly submitted. And so to kind of get the creative juices flowing. So first is wildfire mitigation. FEMA has three very standard project types under wildfire mitigation. Those are defensible space that is done in close proximity to structures or homes to reduce the risk of wildfire burning homes down. Second is hazardous fuel reduction. This is more an open space or park type of areas where you're not doing the work directly adjacent to structures, but you are protecting structures within 2 miles of the treatment. FEMA won't fund hazardous fuel reduction projects in very remote areas where there's not a direct correlation between the fuels modification and risk reduction to properties in the project proximity. And last, there's ignition resistant construction. This would be modifying the building envelopes of structures in the wildland urban interface to reduce wildfire risk. So switching out shake shingle roofs or siding, as an example, to Class A roofs that are capable of withstanding higher temperatures and are not as likely to burn. Changing out windows, placing vent screens on vents to prevent embers from entering structures and burning them down internally. Other items that can be done as part of wildfire mitigation projects is certainly soil erosion control activities in areas that have been burned by wildfire. We know there's a lot of significant impacts on those slopes, and so FEMA is willing to reforest those areas or put erosion control measures in place to prevent impacts to downstream critical infrastructure property. Next slide, please. Another common mitigation activity in California is mitigating seismic risk. So this is again done generally in 3 ways. First is non-structural seismic projects, which are intended to protect components of a structure from failing. This could be tying down bookcases and file cabinets in office buildings, so that they don't cause a harm to people or people passing by the building on the exterior. There's also structural retrofits, which are intended to protect the structure itself from failing, putting in bracing as an example, or other types of modifications to make the structure more seismically resilient. And that can also then be applied, that practice, to infrastructure as well. So if you have a pipeline, for example, a natural gas pipeline that was constructed using very outdated materials that are very brittle or subject to breaking during an earthquake, and wanted to switch that out to a more pliable solution, or include joints so that it can move more freely without breaking, that's certainly something we could look at as an example of an infrastructure seismic retrofit. Next slide. Drought is also a more common project type recently, just due to the ongoing impacts of drought in the past few years. This is a relatively new project type for FEMA. We're still kind of establishing precedent and setting the boundaries for what are common practices and commonly accepted project types. That said, aquifer storage and recharge is a very common project type, whether that be through actively pumping water below ground to established aquifers and then pumping it above ground in time of drought, or using spreading basins to kind of passively recharge those aquifers is certainly something we see frequently as well. Another project that we're starting to see a lot more interest in is more efficiently using gray water, or what people refer to as purple water projects. This is recycled water and using that to irrigate agricultural fields or community areas in place of potable drinking water that's been treated to a high level. Installation of production wells is something that we're seeing as well, and increased capacity to treat water or create more gray water as a treatment component of an existing water treatment plant. So this is certainly a fascinating and interesting new project type for FEMA. And if you have drought projects, certainly would be interested in talking with you. One common issue that we see with these projects is we have to demonstrate that the community has the water rights if necessary. So be mindful. We would expect that those are fully adjudicated and not subject to kind of an ongoing legal battle. And that's a common issue we see with drought projects. Next slide. Utility and infrastructure protection is kind of a catch-all for this program. It's an analogous project type that's frequently used when you don't fit neatly into kind of the boxes or that I've described earlier as far as wildfire or seismic retrofit. But some examples of what that could look like, right? If you wanted to underground power lines or utilities that are above ground and are exposed to wildfire risk, that would be considered a utility and infrastructure project driven by wildfire risk, not necessarily a wildfire project, right? Same with if you had infrastructure that was crossing a fault line, right? And there was no way of really adequately reducing that risk by other means, and you wanted to realign that pipeline by relocating it, we would call that an infrastructure and utility protection project. So just some examples again. The one of the strengths of this program is it's malleable to kind of capture some of these activities and needs from communities, and this is a bit of that broader type of activity. Next slide, please. Flood, as you can imagine, there's a lot of interest in flood as well, and we can mitigate many different types of flooding, certainly sea level rise or lack of stormwater capacity, or stormwater runoff is a frequent one. Riverine or stream flooding, lack of capacity or recent development, which is channeling more water to streams which don't have the capacity to convey that water, is a common flood type, flood mitigation project type. So really what we again need to reiterate is that generally for flood, we do need to see H&H studies to really assess, okay, what is the current design of the system? What is the current level of protection afforded by the system? And what are you building to? So that we can say, yes, here's the level of protection increase, and you can clearly demonstrate that design engineering has accounted for flows or runoff as an example. Next slide, please. All right, so as far as next steps, certainly didn't want to talk through all of this without kind of giving you an outlet for, I'm sure, your excitement to now apply and seek funding through these programs. First off, we can't emphasize enough, Cal OES has an email listserv that you can sign up on their website. So you can get notifications of available funding, timelines, or webinars that Cal OES is putting on with regards to these programs. So strongly encourage you to sign up for that, so you're kind of always in the know about what's going on and what funding may be available. Cal OES, it puts on a very robust webinar schedule when funding becomes available to provide that technical assistance and support to communities so they can better understand best practices, and certainly encourage you to sign up for those and participate as necessary. Cal OES constantly updates its website for their NOFO, for example, for HMGP DR 4683. The current amount of funding estimate is $55 million. We expect that to increase because it's driven by damages that are determined through the damage assessment process as a result from the atmospheric flooding events, atmospheric river events. So stay tuned. Again, Cal OES will update their website to reflect the most recent and up-to-date information. You can certainly access the notice of interest on the Cal OES Engage portal. You can just Google that, and you should be taken to a link to that. So, if you want to schedule a call before submitting a notice of interest, strongly encourage you to do that. You can request those calls at hma@caloes.ca.gov, and we can talk through your project as well. So those are the main things. Be mindful of, again, these upcoming timelines from Cal OES. so you're not missing out on this opportunity. Next slide. And these are live links. I believe Sarah and Abby will be sending out today's presentation to attendees or posting it on their website, so you can access these links. These are resources to fully outline these programs, the requirements and the opportunities, so that again, you're submitting eligible projects and not hoping to get funding for something that just doesn't align with the funding requirements. Next slide. Okay. So I know our team has been responding to questions in the chat, but if you wanted to ask a question, feel free to take yourself off mute and we'll be happy to do our best to answer.
Thank you so much to Scott and Amelia and Lauren for